Okay, and welcome to technically what is lecture one of Economics 352. Again, I'm your professor, Todd Yarbrough, and let's get started. I think the first thing that we want to do in a class like this, a class that's supposed to be part of a sequence of classes, is make sure that we have that sequencing, make sure that we sort of have the ideas that we want to have in our mind. And what we'll do here is we'll just kind of cover some what I would refer to as kind of basic economic ideas. This is meant to really refresh your knowledge base from that principles class, which you may have taken, a very long time ago. I've taught classes where intermediate classes where students haven't had principles courses for a decade. That obviously can be very challenging. Hopefully you haven't had that long of a delay in terms of taking this class, but we want to make sure that we're just, we have some certain things in a sense set in stone before we get started. Now, real quick, just to give you a little bit, because I'm going to be throwing in a lot of these sort of historical nuggets throughout the semester. So you see this contraption, if you will, in front of me. So this is a schematic drawing of actually a machine that was built by the economist Irving Fisher. As you can see here in the tidbit here, he wrote a dissertation, wrote his doctoral thesis, and not only did he write something, but he also built a machine that was supposed to essentially illustrate the point of pricing mechanisms, various pricing mechanisms, and how they might affect and how markets are interrelated. Irving Fisher ends up being a really important person in the context of this particular class, and so we'll come back to this idea a little bit later. But I just thought it was really cool that back at the early 20th century, one of the what would become one of the top economists of that century was literally building a machine to try to understand the economy and illustrate points about the economy. And I think that this highlights the sort of systems nature of the economy, in that there's kind of levers and pulleys and sliders and dials and everything, and they're sort of constantly moving, and policymakers have some influence on some of that, and understanding how the dynamics sort of play out on their own, and then also how the dynamics would play out in the presence of policy is obviously paramount to what we're doing in this particular class. So, in almost every economics class you've ever taken, you start with the circular flow. It doesn't matter if it's principles of micro, it doesn't matter if it's principles of macro. The idea of the circular flow is that this is the way that we used to think economic systems basically worked. Now, this is a fairly complicated circular flow. Usually when we talk about circular flows, we just have sort of these two main bold arrows here. These are tend to be the only ones that we have. And the point of the circular flow is that you have consumption and you have production. And then they have this sort of feedback loop-esque relationship with each other. So production creates consumption, and then consumption in turn creates consumption. This is, I think, a fairly interesting way to think about economic systems. And I would also argue that it is, in some sense, a correct way to think about the macroeconomic system. Now, the question sort of is this it? Is this the entire story? Is this enough for us to understand that there seems to be this positive feedback between the production of an economy and the consumption of economy? Obviously not. That's not all that we ultimately care about, or certainly not the case that the circular flow does an adequate job of explaining all the complexities of the economy, but it's a good starting off point. It's a good starting off point. So basically, the way that we're going to think about economic systems is really, in a sense, this sort of flow. That there's this flow of economic activity that's sort of circling production and consumption. It's flowing, it's flowing, it's flowing. Now, sometimes, of course, what happens is the flow kind of slows down. So, and then sometimes the flow is a lot, right? And then sometimes it slows down, and sometimes it's a lot, right? So I think that this is a simple way to think about economic systems, and I also think it tends to be useful as a jumping off point. And so we might sort of refer to the circular flow within the set of what we refer to as classical economics. So when we talk about classical economics, we're talking about Adam Smith, we're talking about David Ricardo, we're talking about John Stuart Mill, Thomas Malthus, all those folks. And really what those folks were most interested in is how do economic systems actually work? What constitutes, as Adam Smith said, those wealth of nations? And for a long time, basically from the publication of Wealth of Nations, 1776, up until essentially the Great Depression, this is roughly how we thought about the macroeconomy. This was sort of the extent of the complexity that we thought of in terms of the macroeconomy. Now, one of the other things that we developed during this sort of classical stage is the so-called idea of comparative advantage. Again, this should be an idea that you've been exposed to. So the concept of comparative advantage is just that in the context of firms that exist in different countries, there are going to be firms in particular countries who, either by virtue of having access to particular types of goods or services, or through an actual efficiency gain they have over other firms in other countries, we have what we refer to as comparative advantages. And so firms develop comparative advantages through having the least opportunity cost with respect to a particular productive effort. So if we have two firms, firm A and firm B, and both of these firms are let's say, contemplating making, blue jeans, but firm A is going to give up more of some other thing that they could produce, let's say computers, than, say, firm B. So firm A gives up comparatively more computers in order to make blue jeans than firm B does. And so as a result, naturally, firm B is going to end up producing blue jeans as it relates to computers, and firm A is more likely to make computers. And so when we talk about profit maximization of firms within countries, and we talk about the development of comparative advantage, the idea here is that this is a market mechanism, that the trade flows occur because of profit maximization. Profit maximization includes the concept of opportunity cost. And so firms in countries that have particular comparative advantages end up generating comparative advantages for those countries. And so in Brazil, for example, coffee, climate, soil, and things like that make it such that coffee farmers in Brazil have comparative advantage over coffee harvesting than in most other parts of the world. So Brazilian farmers focus on coffee harvesting, and they export those goods. And then other parts of the world imports coffee and then exports things to Brazil. So the U.S., for example, we have a comparative advantage in like high-tech manufacturing processes, high-cost manufacturing processes. So we export high technological products and services to Brazil while we import coffee from Brazil. And again, the idea here is that these are market generated. Now, we'll talk, this semester about the concept of industrial policy. Can a country basically engineer themselves into particular comparative advantages, or can they engineer themselves to make particular things? They can try, but we'll talk about, what are the difficulties therein, and so on and so forth. Supply and demand, right? I hopefully this is not something that I have to sort of spend too much time on, but we tend to think in terms of supply and demand. What that means, from a practical perspective, is that when we talk about markets, our assumption is that those markets are in some way governed by the forces of supply and demand. Now, it's true. It's true that some markets adhere themselves more to the simple framework of supply and demand than other markets. But we actually know that. We actually know what are the characteristics that cause a market to behave more according to the predictions of supply and demand than other. So we have a pretty good understanding of how we can take a simple concept like supply and demand and then complicate it to turn it towards a lot of different types of markets and a lot of different types of market structures. That ends up being a fairly important concept for us in this class, because the way in which consumers interact with producers in the micro sense is where we get those macroeconomic outcomes. So when we talk about, say, the supply and demand of, like I said, blue jeans, or the supply and demand of eggs, or the supply and demand of automobiles, we can certainly talk about those industries within the context of the supply and demand, of their own product. But more often than not, what we're interested in is, say, for example, let's say the demand for automobiles increases. Right. What else is this going to cause? Is this going to have any macroeconomic ramifications? Is it going to spill over into other markets? If we're talking about the auto market, the answer, of course, is yes. The auto market is incredibly macroeconomically important. If demand for automobiles increases and the price of automobiles increases, as we can see here, this is going to have macroeconomic effects. And so we want to have a pretty good understanding of how some of those simple supply and demand dynamics play out, not only in a micro sense, but certainly also in a macro sense. So you're going to make sure that you have a pretty good understanding of just some basic supply and demand. And again, if you've not had a principles class for a while, this may be worthwhile to kind of go back and review. I'll post some review material as well. Now, we can take supply and demand and we can start pointing it to all different types of markets. So what about labor markets, for example, right? So here we have two hypothetical labor markets. The one on the left is a low wage market. The one on the right is a high wage market. We can talk about what are the dynamics of these two markets that produce these two different wage outcomes. But we can certainly apply the idea of supply and demand to labor markets. That's one of the things that we're going to do in this particular class. However, there are some pretty significant caveats to particularly pointing supply and demand at labor markets. And so that'll be kind of an interesting conversation that we have a little bit later. And a lot of that has to do with the concept of wage flexibility. So in other words, to what extent do wages actually sort of move relative to changes in labor markets? That's going to affect the extent to which we can expect to see labor market dynamics reflect supply and demand. And then ultimately, concepts like wage flexibility and price flexibility sort of writ large end up having huge implications for our macroeconomic analysis. Capital markets, same thing as labor markets, although capital markets tend to work within the context of supply and demand a little bit more than labor markets. So we'll talk about the market for loanable funds. You can basically think about the market for loans. Most capital purchases are very, very expensive financed capital purchases. So ultimately, capital markets end up being mostly about loans and ultimately savings, which is sort of an interesting tidbit about the macroeconomic system. And so again, you want to kind of get yourself into the mindset of thinking about not only kind of supply and demand, but then also thinking about supply and demand with respect to goods and services markets, labor markets, capital markets. And that'll go a long way in kind of, again, setting it up. So then later when we start adding in a lot more of that complexity, it'll be grounded. It'll be grounded in basic economic theory, which is the goal here. Economic growth. How do we think about economic growth? Well, we tend to think about it in this sort of cyclical sense, right? It sort of goes down during recessionary periods and goes up during what we refer to as boom periods. And that has its benefits, it has its costs. A lot of what macroeconomics ends up being about is, to what extent should the government try to, cut this, recessionary period off? And let's say maybe we can get economic growth to instead go back to trend instead of letting it fall down, right? Maybe we can do that with policy. But if we were to do that with policy, are there any symptoms or side effects of doing that? And the answer, of course, is yes. Everything in economics involves what we refer to as a trade-off. And so if the government attempts to reduce the negative impacts of a recession, there's going to be some trade-offs there that we have to contemplate. And then, of course, also, if we think about it, can the government try to juice economic growth and get the economy to grow very, very quickly? And that certainly ends up being a story of trade-offs. Namely, if we just want to think about sort of GDP, kind of just the size of the economic system, typically, if GDP goes up, this also causes inflation to go up. So you're going to see me use pi for inflation in this particular class. And so if we have economic growth, we tend to also have inflation. And so there's a little bit of that trade-off. If we instead choose a less inflationary set of policies, it might, mean that we get less of a boost to GDP. So again, this will be a lot of what we talk about throughout the semester. What are the trade-offs of macroeconomic policy? What are the trade-offs of economic stability? How important is economic stability, and how much should the government worry about maintaining economic stability? Aggregate supply, aggregate demand. We're going to talk a lot about aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So hopefully you were exposed to it, but even if you weren't, it's going to be something that we talk a lot about. So aggregate supply, aggregate demand is just this idea of, we're going to take the supply and demand concept and we're going to think about it in a macro sense. We're going to think about it in terms of macroeconomic demand, so aggregate demand, and macroeconomic supply in terms of aggregate. In terms of supply. In macroeconomics, the supply curve here comes from what we refer to as a production function. And the aggregate demand comes from expenditure in the economic system. So basically, how much can the economy produce? And that's what the production function tells us. And then how much can the economy spend? And that's what the expenditure side looks like. And so in this particular graph, you can see that expenditure is increasing for some reason. This could be a policy. So this could be the government cutting taxes, or this could be the government increasing spending, or this could be what we refer to as an exogenous shock. So we could say could be policy or exogenous shock. Regardless of the reason why aggregate demand shifts to the right, we can see that when aggregate demand shifts to the right, this puts upward pressure on prices, but we do get higher output as a result. So the question from a policy perspective is that if aggregate demand shifts for a seemingly random reason, an exogenous shock, should we worry about this inflation? Should we do something about this inflation? If instead this aggregate demand shift occurred because of a policy, we actually were trying to boost aggregate demand, how much inflation are we willing to endure, right? These are the big questions that we're going to ask in this particular class. Now, as I've mentioned before, this class ends up being very quantitatively rigorous. That's mostly algebra and a little bit of calculus. I find, in fact, that when it comes to the difficulty students find in the class, very often it ends up being, for example, laws of exponents. So we'll be dealing with production functions and utility functions that have exponents. And so as a result, these exponent rules themselves end up being something that sort of tends to mess students up a little bit. So it isn't even like the calculus that ends up being really the difficult thing at times. It ends up being some of those more algebraic concepts. So you'll want to sort of update yourself in terms of rules of exponents, rules of natural logs. I'll post some supplemental material for this kind of stuff. I mean, two equations and two unknowns, those sorts of ideas. That's a lot of what we're going to rely upon are mathematical models that have equilibrium conditions, and we have to find the parameters that cause that equilibrium, and then we'll change those parameters and we'll see what happens to the equilibrium to the extent that it changes. So I mean, you're going to want to feel very strong in terms of just some basic algebraic things, notably exponents and natural logs. And then calculus. I mean, to some extent, the sort of calculus in this class ends up being mostly about derivatives, first order conditions, second order conditions. We'll do some Lagrangians here at the very beginning with utility maximization. But at the end of the day, it's simple derivatives for the most part, simple first and second order conditions, solving for global minimums, global maximums, things like that. So again, if you haven't had calculus in a while, it might behoove you to go back and just do a little bit of review in terms of taking derivatives. These end up being kind of the main sort of derivative rules that come up in this particular class. Power rule, obviously, but then also the product rule, quotient rule. And we end up taking a lot of partial derivatives in this class. And so that ends up being another important piece. I will carry out quite a bit of math. So I will take derivatives in front of you on the whiteboard here, so like y equals x squared. And obviously this is going to be a very simple derivative. And so the derivative of that with respect to x is going to be 2x, right? Something sort of similar to that. You may also sometimes see we might say y prime is equal to 2x, or we just use prime to denote derivatives. But again, I'm going to take you through this stuff. You're going to see me do this. This is notational and all that. I'm going to explain that. So just kind of hold on for the ride, so to speak. Beyond the theory, I think the other important thing to keep in mind is that economics is nowadays extremely empirical. There's actually not a lot of new theory. I would say that economics is 80% empirical, 20, maybe less than 20% theoretical. And what that means is that mostly what we do in economics nowadays is we use data to test theories. We use data to ask questions like policy related questions. So if the government cuts taxes, what do we expect to happen to GDP? If the government deregulates, let's say the automotive industry, what do we expect to happen to imports and exports? Let's say some other country opens up a brand new, solar panel factory. What's that going to mean for solar panel factories here in the United States, right? So, that's a lot of what we do nowadays, empirical analysis of economic questions. And so that's why in this class, we're going to do a lot of theory, but we're going to make sure throughout that we're always coming back and we're looking at the data and what it has to say about our theory. And I will expose you, throughout the semester to some of those empirical techniques that you wouldn't necessarily get in a typical intermediate macro class. That's going to be one of the sort of hooks that I have, is that we're going to talk about that empirical side maybe a little bit more than you would normally get in a traditional intermediate macro class. And so we'll talk about the use of regressions. We'll talk about the caveats of regressions and what do you have to be concerned about when you're running regressions and when you're trying to make causal interpretations of, for example, policy questions and so on and so forth. And so, this kind of review is just, again, to kind of remind you what economics is, right? It's a discipline that's interested in how market dynamics translate into human prosperity. And so the way that we think about how that system works in its simplest form, going back to circular flow, to its more complicated form in terms of general equilibrium analysis, which is something that we're going to talk about here pretty soon. My hope is that we get a nice full picture of what economics is in 2025. I don't want the class to feel old, and certainly want to make sure that it's useful. And again, I think one of the ways that it'll be very useful is if we have a significant focus on the empirical side. So big ticket stuff, circular flow, classical economic idea, supply and demand, neoclassical sort of economic idea. The ability to think about labor markets and capital markets, the idea of the cyclical nature of the economy and things like inflation and unemployment, and sort of always in the back of our mind, never being satisfied with just theoretical dynamics, but wanting to take that theory and look at data and see to what extent data aligns with the theory.